I have a responsibility today to cover an issue that I think is very, very important. And as a pastor and as one who did have the opportunity to throw my name in the discussion for governor, I encountered this question a lot. Plus, I've encountered it a lot personally, and I bet you have too. So I want to try to deal today with the question of why most preachers are pro-lifers instead of abolitionists. And the last part of the message or speech or delivery or whatever it is will be on one particular reason. I'm going to zero in on that. But before we do, we have a culture that is coming apart, and we're being led by people who don't even know what they're talking about. This is a direct quote. We need to take back all three chambers of Congress. I didn't know there were three chambers. Rather all three chambers of government. I didn't know government had three chambers: the presidency, the Senate, and the House. She's probably referring to the executive, legislative, and judicial. This is a direct quote. Speaking of Nancy Pelosi, she said, she is the leader Leader Pelosi. Hopefully, well, she'll see. She's the current leader of the party, and I think that the party absolutely does have its leadership in the House. We have our leadership in the Senate as well. Now, I don't know if you can understand that, but I can't. So I have found that the new face of the Democrat Party is just like the old face. So, yeah. Okay. Now, let's talk about something. When I finished up the other day, I stopped right here. So I'm going to pick up right here. If you remember the quote by William Booth, he said, in the 1800s, so this would be the 19th century, he's predicting, he says, the chief danger of the 20th century will be religion without the Holy Ghost, Christianity without Christ, forgiveness without repentance, salvation without regeneration, politics without God, and heaven without hell. It sounds like he's reading our mail, because everything that he predicted is now a predominant thing in many mainstream churches, which is alarming. Evangelical churches are beginning to crumble and compromise, as you know. Even the Southern Baptist Convention that I've been part of most of my ministry, not now, I'm pastoring a church that's independent, but the Southern Baptist Convention has twice elected a man who is embracing all kinds of wrong things. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. So William Booth was right. So I want to talk about how pastors impacted the culture earlier in our history. Now, tomorrow morning in this church, I will be doing the Bringing Back the Black Robe Regiment presentation, which actually is a dramatic, me in period costume. I act and become some of these men, multimedia presentation that if you're going to be around, I would invite you to come, because I think you'll not only enjoy it, I think it will show you some things and maybe inspire you. But I want to just delve into it a little bit. This is a Methodist bishop in 1898 referring to the pastors of the 18th century. So we're talking about the 1700s. I want you to listen to what he said about these men. Mighty men they were, of iron nerve, strong hand, and of unblanched cheek, and heart of flame. God needed not reed shaken by the wind, not men clothed in soft raiment, but heroes of hardihood and lofty courage, to be the voice of a new kingdom crying in this western wilderness. Is that how you would describe most modern preachers that you know much about? Now, preachers at this event, yes. The pastor that's hosting this event, Brother Paul Thompson, yes. The pastor of this church that's allowing us to use their facilities, yes. But the typical evangelical pastor does not resemble the man that this Methodist bishop is talking about. Now, the pastors took a very active role, saw no problem with mixing their faith with the culture and the politics. They didn't believe in separation of church and state. The only correctness they were worrying about was not political but biblical correctness. And these pastors were incredibly involved. This is a painting of a man by the name of James Caldwell, who was a Presbyterian at the Battle of Springfield, New Jersey. He throws hymn books out at his men because they've run out of wadding for their muskets. These hymn books are filled with Isaac Watts hymns. They're tearing Isaac Watts hymns out, shoving them down the muzzles of their flintlocks, firing at the British, and all the while that preacher is yelling, "Give them Watts, boys, put Watts into them." That's the kind of pastors that we have. This is Peter Muhlenberg out of Woodstock, Virginia, who eventually became a major general. His statue is in Statuary Hall today in our nation's capital. He's also in the painting that pictures the surrender of Cornwallis. He was a Lutheran preacher and then was ordained as an Anglican because he had to be Anglican to pastor in Virginia because their state church was Anglican. So he was a Lutheranized Anglican preacher or an Anglicized Lutheran preacher. I don't know which way it goes, but I think he was probably Lutheran through and through. His brother Frederick was also a pastor in New York City. In fact, Frederick Muhlenberg became the first Speaker of the House of the United States of America and is the original signer on the Bill of Rights. He's a preacher. He's a Lutheran preacher. The pastors were very active in the war effort in the Continental Army. This is a painting of the pastors at Valley Forge. Peter Muhlenberg was one of the pastors who was there. Joab Houghton from First Baptist Church, Hopewell, New Jersey, was there. And they ministered to those troops and General Washington and all these other guys during that terrible winter of 1777-78 when they were freezing and starving to death. And I think it was the ministry of those pastors that held it all together. This is John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was a Presbyterian. He was the president of Princeton. He was also a member of the Continental Congress and is a signer of the Declaration, and actually gave a short speech to encourage the men to sign the Declaration because they were getting weak-kneed and we're gonna give up and not actually vote to sue for independence. This is Henry Ward Beecher, who was a pastor in the 1800s in New York. He was an abolitionist. Now, many of these men we would have doctrinal issues with. I'll be the first one to tell you that. They were from all different cuts and denominational backgrounds, but these men were not ashamed. And of course, you can go all the way up into the 1960s, and even though you may have things about Martin Luther King Jr. that you don't like, and I may be one of those, you can't deny the fact that as a Baptist preacher, he led the civil rights movement, and it came out of the church. This is all kind of to whet our appetite about pastors and what has happened to them today. Because you don't see this typically. I mean, every now and then a Jerry Falwell or a Dr. D. James Kennedy or someone will show up, a Dr. Dobson or someone. But I mean, generally, this is not the rule. What has happened? So when it comes to the issue of pro-life versus abolition, there's got to be a reason why most pastors promote a pro-life position over a pro-abolitionist position because they're doing it mostly. And you get ostracized, don't you, Brother Paul, if you embrace the abolitionist position. And these preachers are promoting it heavily. And so why is this? Because they all will tell you it's the horrible, heinous murder of a preborn human. Why in the world then would these pastors who you know hate this practice be pro-lifers when they could be more than that? So I want to give you a few reasons. First of all, one that you probably already suspect or already know. Many are under the false illusion that the pro-life movement is committed to actually ending abortion as soon as possible. You may find that hard to believe, but most pastors that I know actually think pro-lifers are trying to end abortion, and they think pro-life organizations are trying to do that. They've not been behind the curtain and have seen what's really going on and how it's pro-life legislators that kill legislation that would actually end abortion. Another reason, many do not actually see, and I mentioned this the other day, abortion as the brutal act that it really is. And so they're willing to accept a slow, measured solution, i.e. incrementalism, through the pro-life movement. They just don't see it as heinous as it really is. They can't. How in the world could you see it as heinous as it is and agree to a slow, measured response? Some fear, and this is probably more of a reason, denominational peer conflict or rejection if they break away from the pro-life ranks. I mean, they're afraid of being pushed out of the circle, and they don't want that. Many fear offending some in their congregations. Now, that is a real fear, because I'm telling you, that happens. And a lot of pastors are afraid they won't be able to feed their families. Now, obviously, that's a lack of faith on their part, and they're supposed to be obedient no matter what the cost. But they're afraid that they're not going to be able to take care of their families. Some believe delving into abortion too deeply is getting political and thus violates the principle of separation of church and state. They believe that's found in the First Amendment, or if they can't find it there, it's somewhere in there. And they'll even tell you that. I've even had that answer given. Well, you know what, somewhere in there. Well, where somewhere in there? And you say, well, is it in the Bible? Well, yeah, it's in there. Where? Well, somewhere in there. I mean, they don't really know, but they've been told separation of church and state is an inviolate principle that they must follow. In fact, it's illegal to not follow it. I mean, I know it's hard to believe this, but I'm telling you guys, these spiritual leaders believe some of this stuff. Now, to thwart that, look at a historian from 1862. Now, this is long after the War of Independence. This is Frank Moore. The preachers of the Revolution did not hesitate to attack the great political and social evils of their day. Didn't hesitate. Here's another preacher, historian, John Wingate Thornton, 1860. The fathers of the Republic did not divorce politics and religion, but they denounced the separation as ungodly. See, what are we told today? We're told the exact opposite. But see, this is what our founding framing preachers believed. But here's the primary reason, I believe, that these guys won't deal with the subject. Because they have been taught that Romans 13 demands slavish submission to government. They've even taught that. Guys, and I mentioned it the other day, so I'm not trying to be redundant because I'm going to drill deep here now. But guys like John MacArthur have become very well known for promoting this position. Now, who am I to correct John MacArthur? In fact, I have a great deal of respect for John MacArthur. I read a lot of his work. I quote from him fairly frequently in sermons and lessons. So it's not like I'm attacking John MacArthur here. But I believe he's wrong on this point. But because he has such an impact, he has impacted a lot of preachers to stay clear. The Baptist Convention, whether it's at the state level or the national, they teach the same thing. We've got to submit. So I want to take just a little bit of time and then deal with this one, because I think this one's so important. Before I do, please understand that I'm not suggesting that we all ought to have a rebellious spirit. The Bible teaches submission, respect for authority, to be lawful and godly. So I'm not talking here about becoming a rebel with a cause and we'll just flaunt law and do whatever we want to do. I'm not an anarchist by any stretch of the imagination. I believe that government is an institution God created, and I believe we must have proper government. But Romans 13, 1 and 2, you know it. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. The authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So that's always used then to say, well, you can't go against the Supreme Court. You can't go against your state Supreme Court. You can't go against the Supreme Court in D.C. You can't go against your state government. You can't go. You're sinning. You're rebelling against authority. This is how Romans 13 is interpreted. Now, the thing that they neglect to think about when they're making this claim is that the Bible is filled with examples of heroes that both God applauded and we celebrate, who actually went against the authorities of their day. Let me give you just a few examples that you're well familiar with. The Hebrew midwives. They disobey Pharaoh, trying to save Jewish baby boys. How about Moses refusing Pharaoh and standing up to him? How about Queen Esther approaching the king uninvited that could have brought the penalty of death on her? How about the three asbestos boys? They wouldn't bend, they wouldn't bow, they wouldn't burn. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow. What about that? They're breaking the law. What about Daniel, who knowingly defied the law by praying and got into trouble? I mean, here's examples. What about Jesus refusing to abide by the Jewish Sabbath laws? Now, I'm not talking about the biblical Sabbath. I'm talking about the Jewish laws that they had added, where he said, your laws have nullified God's law. Those were just as binding as Roman laws to the Jews. He didn't obey those. What about the apostles and the early Christians refusing to stop preaching when it was unlawful for them to preach Christ? What about believers through the ages defying ungodly authorities? For instance, how about the state of Wisconsin? Refused to abide by the Fugitive Slave Act. And they said if a slave makes it to Wisconsin, they're a free person. And actually put their money where their mouths were and did it, right? Jason, I mean, you're being more of an authority of this than I am. They're defying. What about Corrie ten Boom and her family? By the way, they weren't Jewish, they were Dutch. but they were saving Jews and going against the German authority that said you need to turn these Jews over. Now, of course, you know her story. Everybody but her and her family was murdered by the Nazis. But we celebrate Corrie ten Boom. How about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran preacher in Germany that was actually a part of if you've seen the movie Operation Valkyrie, he was a part of trying to get Hitler bumped off, and eventually was captured, imprisoned, and was executed by the Nazis 2 weeks before the prison camp that he was held in was liberated by the Allied forces. But he's a Lutheran preacher. His book on discipleship and how to live in community together is still being used by churches all over the world. What about Oskar Schindler? You've seen the movie Schindler's List. Well, we celebrate him as a hero for trying to save over 1,000 Jews and was successful. But he's blatantly disobeying German authority. Are we going to say that he was wrong? And then back to Martin Luther King. He's defying the Jim Crow laws and what the federal government is saying. Now, he's doing it civilly, which is, I think, critical. He wasn't out there throwing bombs. He wasn't throwing grenades. But we celebrate Martin Luther King. I can't think of any major city in my travels that there is not at least one Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. There's one in Oklahoma City. But we celebrate this, right? Now, here's something important to remember theologically. Paul wrote the book of Romans somewhere around 56 to 57 AD, okay? He was writing it because there were Jews in Rome who had become Christian, who were saying that what Christians ought to do is just obey God and not the authorities. And so there was a massive problem, and there was a huge deportation of these Christians, and Paul is trying to help the Christians in Rome to bring things back into a little bit of a balance. You say, yeah, but he was writing to tell those Christians to submit to that wicked Nero. Well, here's a very important point that you need to know. The wicked Nero that we all know in history does not appear until 64 AD. You see, before that, when Paul wrote Romans, Nero was kind of neutral toward Christianity. Seneca was still his advisor and kept him balanced. It wasn't until after Seneca was out of the picture and then Rome burns and Nero blames it on the Christians. That's when those terrible persecutions under Nero begin. So when Paul writes Romans, he's not telling them to submit to a tyrant. Nero's not a tyrant yet. You say, well, he was in his heart. Well, maybe so, but he wasn't outwardly acting like the tyrant that we know him as. So that argument is even taken away. But here's the other thing we need to remember. It's not just Paul that says we need to submit to authority. Peter says the same thing. In fact, Peter's passage in 1 Peter 2 is almost identical to Romans 13. So what are Peter and Paul doing? Are they telling us that we just have to offer unlimited submission to whoever's in power and just take your lumps? Is that what they're saying? So let's ask these questions then. If they're telling us that we should submit, then how do we reconcile that with other examples of these biblical believers who defied authority and God applauded them, like the Hebrew midwives? We just gave you a list. Well, isn't that a contradiction? I mean, if Paul and Peter are saying you're to offer unlimited submission to authority no matter how wicked they are, then isn't that a contradiction to all the biblical examples we just kind of covered quickly? Well, of course it is. Ironically, by refusing to remain silent about their own faith, Peter and Paul found themselves crossways with authority. So they're not even practicing what they're preaching if that's what they meant. Well, I believe that's not what they meant. Now, just briefly, remember that Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 are not the only passages that talk about submission. You've heard this before. Paul tells wives, submit to your husbands. Ephesians 6:1, children, submit to your parents. 1 Timothy 3:5, 5:17, congregations, submit to your spiritual leadership. Does that mean unlimited? There's no limits to that submission? The husband can tell his wife to do anything he wants to, and she has to do it to be obedient to God. Children have to do whatever their parents say, and the congregation has to put up with it no matter how heretical their pastor becomes, because he's an authority. No one would interpret those passages that way. So why do we interpret Romans 13 that way? Because it's convenient, especially when it comes to the issue of abortion. See, we can just say, well, I've washed my hands, I'm just obeying. They're the ones at fault, not me. So, in Romans 13, Paul actually goes on to define the kind of government that you and I should offer full submission to. Let me just note these very quickly. In verse 4, he says, the kind of government that acts as God's minister for good. Secondly, a government that avenges evil by executing wrath on those who do evil. And third, he says, a government that protects and rewards those who do good. I mean, come on, this is not rocket science. This is not a political science classroom. Paul is making it clear the kind of government that deserves our submission. The government that punishes bad guys and rewards good guys. That's proper government. So then, the question comes then, if Paul is clearly teaching that proper government is the one that we should submit to, then what is the believer to do when their government becomes wicked and rewards the doers of evil instead of punishing them? Because that's actually what's going on with the issue of abortion. We're actually protecting the ones who are murdering these children. Now, our government's protecting other wicked doers as well. But what are we to do? Well, when the laws of men bring us into conflict with God's higher law, we must always default to God's law, right? We must always defy. There's an example here in Acts 5. You're all familiar with this. Peter is told, and the other apostles, you can't preach in the name of Jesus. And they said, we ought to obey God rather than men. Unfortunately, there comes a time in all of our lives when we may have to stand up against wicked authority. And when we do that, we need to be very, very careful. We must understand the consequences. We must also do it in a godly spirit and knowing that we've pretty much exhausted every other option that we had. By the way, that's what happened to the pastors in the 1700s that finally led the men of their churches and communities off to fight. They had exhausted every option that they could think of. Here's one of them. You can see it. His name is Samuel West. This is out of an election sermon that he preached to the legislature of Massachusetts. This is all the legislators, House and Senate for our state, and the governor and the lieutenant governor. They're all there. He has a captive audience, and he preaches this sermon. I'm just going to give you a little piece of it. A slavish submission to tyranny is a proof of a very sordid and base mind. All good magistrates, while they faithfully discharge the trust reposed in them, ought to be religiously and conscientiously obeyed. The reason why the magistrate is called the minister of God is because he is to protect, encourage, and honor them that do well, and to punish them that do evil. Therefore, it is our duty to submit to them, not merely for fear of being punished by them, but out of regard to the divine authority under which they are deputed to execute judgment and do justice. If magistrates are no farther ministers of God than they promote the good of the community, then obedience to them neither is nor can be unlimited. For it would imply a gross absurdity to assert that when magistrates are ordained by the people solely for the purpose of being beneficial to the state, they must be obeyed when they are seeking to ruin and destroy it. Unlimited submission and obedience is due to none but God alone. Whenever then the ruler encourages them that do evil and is a terror to those that do well, as soon as he becomes a tyrant, he forfeits his authority to govern and becomes the minister of Satan, and as such ought to be opposed. This is the kind of stuff that was being preached in the churches in the 1770s in the colonies. This is why they were willing to go off and fight. So would we claim that we should obey a government that does this to people in Germany? No, of course not. Well, what about our own Supreme Court? Well, you know all the history. Russell's probably already covered this, but you know the Dred Scott decision. Black people aren't people. Black people are property. That's what the U.S. Supreme Court said, right? Well, it was the Supreme Court. They've got to be right. Right? Wrong. We all know they were wrong. Well, what about in Buck versus Bell? You can forcefully sterilize someone against their will if you have the legal authority to do it. Is that proper? Is that a right decision? Of course not. What about the Korematsu decision in 1944 that you can take Americans maybe 3 generations removed from Japan, but because they are of a Japanese descent, you can take them, take their property from them, their businesses, put them in concentration camps, and they lose everything. You think that's right? We ought to obey something like that? Of course not. And then, of course, what we're all very familiar with, Roe v. Wade. Do you see a pattern here? So all of a sudden we're supposed to obey Roe v. Wade, but Dred Scott was wrong and Buck versus Bell now is abhorrent to us. It doesn't make sense. Here's another preacher out of the Revolution period. This is Joseph Lathrop. As you can see, he was a pastor in West Springfield, Massachusetts. This is just a little short quote. He preached it on a day of public thanksgiving in 1787. Perhaps it will be asked, is there no case in which a people may resist government? Yes, there is one such case, and that is when rulers usurp a power oppressive to the people and continue to support it by military force in contempt of every respectful remonstrance. That means petition. In this case, the body of the people have a natural right to unite their strength for the restoration of their own constitutional government. Notice how he's contrasting tyranny with a constitutional government. Well, see, pastors don't understand this. They also don't understand that our government is very different from the one that Paul or Jesus lived under. Because you'll hear people say, well, Jesus never said anything about getting active in government. Paul never said anything about getting active in government. Well, first of all, that was not their mission. Jesus came to die as a ransom for sinners. Paul's mission was to plant the New Testament church. He was an apostle. But they were not living under the kind of government where you even could have an input. They lived under a dictatorship, and eventually it became incredibly tyrannical. How in the world could they have an added input? But guys, our form of government is very different. Our form of government is built upon representative principles called federalism. The only way that can work is if the people understand they're the key. You only have to look at the Declaration of Independence to get it, where they tell us governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the what? Of the governed, not the courts, not the governor, the governed. It's the people. So therefore, in our representative form of government, the people are the governing authorities, and it is the consent of the governed to which Christians must submit. Well, this is very different than our thinking these days. So what should we do if our federal government exceeds its rightful authority, which they did a long time ago, in areas more than just the murder of preborn children? So what do? We're just stuck with it. We're Christians. We can't resist because that's a sin. Well, no, that's not even what Scripture teaches. Let's go back to the guys that wrote it. Here's James Madison. James Madison was the chief author of the Constitution. In the Virginia Resolution, I want you to listen to what he says. In the case of a deliberate, palatable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, he's talking about the Constitution. The states, that would be Idaho, Oklahoma, who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil. When I was running for governor, that's what I was intending to do. I was simply intending to follow the advice of the guy who wrote the Constitution. Now you say, well, Dan, a lot of time has passed, things have changed. Well, you're right about that. So we may have to come to the place that we admit that we no longer live in a representative republic. We may not now. But I'm functioning as though we do. Let's listen to one other guy. This is the guy who authored the Declaration of Independence, our birth certificate. It has all the key principles in it that the Constitution doesn't have. Listen to what he says that you should do if the government exceeds its power. That whensoever the general government, now that's what we call federal, right? Assumes undelegated powers, its acts are what? Unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Now, these are the two authors of our founding documents. Madison, the Constitution; Jefferson, the Declaration. Now, you say, well, so what are you calling for, Dad? Are you calling for some kind of armed revolt? No. But what I am saying is that preachers who won't preach abolition and say it's wrong and the Supreme Court is wrong and teach their people these things because they're afraid they're sinning if they become unsubmissive to a tyrannical government need to learn these facts and adjust their teaching and their position. So if we stand against government, doesn't that make us a bunch of rebels? Well, listen to what Paul says in Romans 12:18. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Clearly implied in that is sometimes it's not going to be possible. You ever been to a deacon's meeting? I'm telling you right now, sometimes it ain't possible. So he's telling us here, you're not always a rebel. Now, if you've never heard of Alice Baldwin, her books are still available, and one particular book is phenomenal. It's called The New England Clergy and the American Revolution. You can still get copies of it online. I want you to listen to this quote. I know this is kind of classroomish, but this is why we don't understand these things. So listen to what she says. Probably the most fundamental principle of the American constitutional system is the principle that no one is bound to obey an unconstitutional act. No single idea was more fully stressed, no principle more often repeated through the first 60 years of the 18th century than that governments must obey law, and that he who resisted one in authority who was violating that law was not himself a rebel, but a protector of law. What we're actually trying to do is return us to the rule of law where there's equal protection, right? We've already heard that during this conference. So let me begin to find a landing spot here and bring this down to a soft landing. So what are the people to do? Well, believe it or not, the actual instructions are in the Declaration of Independence. You probably know this, but we need to think this way, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, protecting our unalienable rights from God, now here's the three-step plan. It is the right, later on he says duty, of the people. Here are the three steps. Alter, that means correct course. Abolish, that means to take a clean sheet of paper and start over, which is what they were doing then. And I think they would be flabbergasted that we haven't already done that. I really do. I think they'd be flabbergasted that we have not already started with a clean sheet of paper. They knew the fallenness of man. And what's the third option? Later on in this very document, he says, or throw it off. Now, what does it mean to throw it off? That's what they were about to do. That means your government is not just off course, it's now a tyranny, and you're going to have to fight against it. Now, I'm not calling for any kind of a war. You're not wanting a war. None of us in this room wants a war. Some people will often say, well, Dan, you're just trying to cause division, and you're a warmonger, and you want people to fight their government. I don't want anything even close to that. But I also don't want my children and my grandchildren to live under a socialistic, tyrannical form of government where life is so cheap that a court can decide who and who cannot live. I don't want them to live under that kind of atmosphere either. And there are those that have preceded us that died brutally on battlefields all over this world so that you and I could have the kind of freedoms we have today. And as Christians, we have a double obligation to make certain that that kind of liberty is protected, no matter what the cost. This is what our framers were telling us. In 1787, Elijah Goodrich, who was a pastor out of Connecticut, preached this: when a constitutional government is converted into tyranny, and the laws, rights, and properties of a free people are openly invaded, there ought not to be the least doubt but that a remedy is provided in the laws of God and reason for their preservation, nor ought resistance in such case to be called rebellion. These are the preachers. Now, to show you just how our framers believed, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams were given the task of designing the first national seal. They presented it to Congress on August the 20th, 1776. Unfortunately, Congress didn't adopt it. But here is a rendering of what they submitted. I want you to look at it. What do they say around the circle? Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Notice in the middle of it, you've got Moses standing on what would be the left side. You have the pillar of fire and cloud, which is the Shekinah glory of God, and Pharaoh's army being drowned in the Red Sea. That is who Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, two of the least religious so-called framers, according to modern historians, suggested as our national seal. What did they think about rebelling to tyrants? They said it's obeying God. That was the mindset that birthed the kind of liberty that we have. So let me give you one last quote. This is from Jonathan Mayhew. Jonathan Mayhew was a well-known preacher back in the Great Awakening, so he precedes the framers. He's more a part of the founding generation. So he's a little before Madison and Washington and all those guys, a little before Peter Muhlenberg and the guys that actually lead their men off to fight. But you listen to what Jonathan Mayhew says. No government is to be submitted to at the expense of that which is the sole end of all government, the common good and safety of society. The only reason of the institution of civil government and the only rational ground of submission to it is the common safety and utility, which mean the general well purpose. If, therefore, in any case, the common safety and utility would not be promoted by submission to government, but the contrary, there is no ground or motive for obedience and submission, but for the contrary. But the duty of unlimited obedience, whether active or passive, can be argued neither from the manner of expression here used. By the way, he's preaching out of Romans 13. Nor from the general scope and design of the passage. So this is what they believed. So here's what he says. When once magistrates act contrary to their office and the end of their institution, when they rob and ruin the public, instead of being guardians of its peace and welfare, they immediately cease to be the ordinance and ministers of God and no more deserve that gracious character than common pirates and highwaymen, what we'd call robbers. So, in keeping with our form of government, our heritage, and proper understanding of passages such as Romans 13, we Christians not only can stand against evil laws and decrees from our government, we are obligated by our faith and our founding documents to do so. And to the preachers, therefore, under God, because of their calling and compelled by righteousness and justice, pastors have no choice but to boldly preach abolition and, as the Holy Spirit leads, do what they can to bring the evil to its end. That's where pastors must be. So we need to begin to reach out to pastors. That's probably a calling that I feel very strongly. We all have different gifts and callings. This is why I'm pointing at the church. I'm pointing at the pastors. I'm trying to get pastors to get it. Because once the pastors get it, the congregations will get it. But the pastors don't get it, the congregations never will. And this is why I think most pastors are pro-lifers instead of abolitionists, because they don't understand these things. Let's pray, would you?